Hey, I'm Sass, and this is my Democracy Gauntlet. So I first want to recognize that voting from home, online, from your phone, is a far more complex issue than most people realize. It's very easy when you're first learning about election security to jump to the conclusion that electronic voting is a bad idea. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. I will say, I do see a path. I'm going to describe it, and then I'll back up and I'll just hit some of the key points. So the way that I see leveraging voting over the internet is to add voting on your phone over the internet from home to everything we already do. So we're not removing anything at all. We're still keeping, voting at polling locations. We're still keeping early voting. We're still keeping mail-in and absentee voting of all kinds. And those all need to be expanded in their own rights. But the way we can do this is if we only allow electronic voting during early voting, and those results are published to a blockchain-based write-only database where there's public and private keys. So each person who voted gets a private key. They can then go and check the way that they voted and see and ensure that their vote was counted correctly. But we only allow this during early voting. If something happens, if there's cord gets plugged or there's some bug or whatever it is, then we can void those votes. We can let those voters know, hey, there was a problem, your vote's been voided. Come to the polls on election day and vote in person, the traditional way. That way, election day acts as the ultimate paper backup for voting. This would not happen all at once. This would necessarily have to be a slow, methodical rollout. It's not guaranteed to work. But there's a couple things here that I just want to point out for those of you who are really suspicious about it. One thing that we've learned more recently about election security is that one of our previously held assumptions may not be as true as we thought, which is the importance of anonymity in the vote. And the whole reason that anonymity in the vote is important is because we don't want vote selling or vote coercion, right? So we don't want people to try to pay people to vote, and we don't want somebody to threaten somebody to vote a certain way. If there's a way that you can prove the way you voted after you voted, then that could happen. But modern research has shown that vote coercion and vote selling are not efficient uses of money to affect the results of an election. The most efficient use of your money is actually just campaigning. And so that's a really important key point here is that, okay, anonymity is not necessarily necessary. If you vote in any of the other traditional ways, your anonymity will still be secured in just the way it always has been. But with internet voting, we can open up that possibility to ensure that the security and that all those votes are being counted, and then we don't have additional votes being put in. And so, like I said, this is a path toward adding electronic voting onto what we currently have to help increase accessibility. Of course, I'm running for a US Congress, so I'm always thinking about this stuff from the federal level. Thinking about federal legislation, I do like that our voting electoral systems are very decentralized. That provides a lot of robust stability in our election systems. But I do think that there could be a little bit more support and a few more provisions from the federal government to help protect the integrity of our election security, whether it's through funds for small jurisdictions that don't have a lot of money to actually get, be able to secure things and go through the training that they need, or verifying and certifying election machines. Our election machines certainly are not secure as they are right now. So there are specifically in the space of accessibility and security, there are some things that I think the federal government can do to add to it. But I really did want to talk about this idea of internet voting. It is a complex issue. It is not to be taken lightly. but I do think that there is a path. The United States, for the last few decades, has had quite astoundingly low levels of voter fraud. It's actually been a really great thing. Despite some of the security holes that I just talked about, it's been going really, really well. And what that means is that now is the time for us to focus on expanding accessibility in voting and ensure that everybody who should have the right to vote actually has the right to vote. I am positive on the decentralized nature of our election system and giving states and municipalities some power over how they do things. It helps to prevent scaled attacks on elections, but we also don't want attacks on voter rights either. Automatic registration, I think, is something that throughout the entire country, things like early voting and mail-in voting works, or early voting absolutely needs to be everywhere. Mail-in voting, when done right, and that's a really important point I want to make here, is that Colorado, Washington, Hawaii, they've shown that mail-in voting can be done really, really well. But we've also seen, as in the New York Democrat primary in 2020, that it can also be done very poorly. So it's really, I want to expand mail-in voting, and I want to provide support for states to increase and improve mail-in voting, but I also want to make sure that it's done correctly. Looking at things like voter ID laws, that's a very muddy term that can mean a whole variety of things. I believe that once you are registered, that you shouldn't have to have your ID with you when you vote because you've already registered. I also believe in same-day registration. That's another thing as well. So if you've registered to vote, then you should be able to vote. It's that simple. And so you can bring your you can bring your ID, or you can bring your voter registration card, or whatever way to identify yourself is appropriate, deemed by your jurisdiction. Gerrymandering. My goodness, we could have an entire or an entire section in the Gauntlet on this, but I will touch on it briefly. Yes, gerrymandering, political gerrymandering in particular, is really, really awful, and we've just seen that the U.S. Supreme Court has said that they're not going to take any cases on gerrymandering after this census, which is awful because the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment actually makes political gerrymandering illegal. That has not yet been argued well in the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it'll still be a while before it is. But to address gerrymandering, kind of the classic route is through independent redistricting commissions. So a combination of citizens and judges and nonpartisan, and maybe including some partisan folks to help draw the lines. So that way we're not using the maps to pick voters. But I also want to highlight a couple of maybe misconceptions about gerrymandering. The primary one being that having weirdly shaped districts inherently implies gerrymandering. The reason that districts are shaped so weird is because our representatives are just terrible at gerrymandering. They're just really bad at it. If you throw this problem at a coder, they could give you maps that are way more gerrymandered, but look way more normal than what our current maps are. So to be a little bit lighthearted, it's kind of interesting that, or kind of irony funny in a way, that our bureaucracy could be worse, but it isn't because of incompetence. But really, if you study the math and the theory around gerrymandering, the reality is that so long as there's any kind of subjectivity or human involvement, you can only make it more fair. You can't make it absolutely fair. The only way to make it absolutely fair is through a deterministic algorithm like shortest split line. Otherwise, you are always making a judgment call, and you are always effectively rigging an election. I don't believe that that Congress should dictate shortest split line across the country. But I do believe that there are some mathematical tools that we can use to help make gerrymandering, or I should say districting, fairer, specifically efficiency gap. That assumes a two-party system, which I don't like, but that is kind of like the latest and greatest in terms of how we measure the evenness or the fairness, so to speak, of districts, or of a combination of districts within a state. And so leveraging that with independent districting commissions, whether it's mandated or we just support and encourage states, I can see arguments in both ways. There is a states' rights thing. But really, and this is the next thing that we're going to talk about in a little bit, is that the real solution, or at least the strongest solution to gerrymandering, is going to be voting method reform, specifically star voting and approval voting. But we'll get to that in a minute. So the way people in power are chosen is the most consequential mechanic of how a nation operates. Currently in the US and many other wealthy democratic nations, we primarily choose government officials through a process, a voting method called choose one voting, which is exactly what you're familiar with, where every citizen gets to make one mark per race on their ballot to show support for a single person to represent them in government. Choose one voting is one of the worst voting methods ever created. Choose one voting systematically polarizes people, feeding this toxic idea that we can only advocate for one group or one set of ideas at a time. This contributes to the dreaded spoiler effect you may have heard of, where similar voters split their votes between two similar candidates, potentially causing both of them to lose to a third candidate who may be disliked by all of those similar voters. Fear of this mechanical problem that's baked into choose one voting leads to the strategic lesser evil voting we find ourselves constantly hearing about, and an inevitable, unavoidable trend toward this two-party system we found ourselves stuck in. It's the math of the method, not a vice of the voters. Fortunately, there are dozens of different voting methods to choose from. One of the blessings of modern voting science is the whittling down to two primary recommendations for voting method reform in the United States right now. And those are star voting and approval voting. I want to tell you about them both, so grab yourself a snack. I like to describe star voting as the ultimate culmination of modern voting science. It was invented in Oregon in 2014. STAR is an acronym. It stands for score, then automatic runoff. And that's exactly how it works. You got all the candidates in your ballot, and then you score them from 0 to 5 stars, a lot like in Amazon rating. And then we add up all the scores for all the candidates across all the ballots. Then the two candidates with the highest scores become finalists, who then move on to the automatic runoff. In the automatic runoff, whichever of those two finalists you scored higher on your ballot, that finalist gets your one full vote. And then whichever finalist gets the most votes wins. And this produces astoundingly accurate results for all sorts of wonderful scientific and mathematical reasons I'm not going to get into right now, but it's really, really incredible what you can pull off with it. One of the things we always have to keep in mind when we're talking about voting method reform is the real world. So it's about more than just, the accuracy and the simplicity. It's also legal viability and cost for implementation. So for star voting, if you try to go to a small jurisdiction that doesn't have a lot of money to spend on ballot redesign or retraining poll workers or some big voter education campaign, or you run into problems with the election code, then star voting can be a bit of a hard sell, which is why I also advocate for approval voting. Now, approval voting is comically simple. Approval voting is simply changing the instructions on the ballot from choose one to choose one or more. And that's it. So instead of bubbling in next to one candidate on the ballot, you can bubble in next to as many candidates as you like, or all the candidates you approve of. And then the tallying is exactly what you're familiar with. We just count up all the votes or all the approvals, and whoever gets the most approvals wins. And this also produces really great results. They're not quite as dead-on accurate as star voting is, but approval voting is about bang for the buck, right? So it's power and simplicity. I like to describe approval voting as the highest and fastest return on investment for any voting method shift from choose one voting in the United States right now. It's just really efficient. So because it approval voting requires zero change to electoral infrastructure. It becomes a viable sell for small jurisdictions who don't have a lot of money to spend. It's also compatible with more election codes than other voting methods may be, and can make it viable in places where star voting may not. But I also want to note that there are places where star voting will be viable, where approval voting will not be viable. And this is a really important thing that I really want to emphasize, is that we can't do it with just one of these. We absolutely need both. There are a lot of people who fight over which voting method is best. But when you actually get into the reform space, you start reading through election codes and you start polling people and you start talking to people and finding out what people care about, and you start looking at the expenses and all of these things, you realize that in the US, because the system is so decentralized and because everything is so different everywhere, we really need both of these systems. So I advocate for both of them very strongly. The main organization promoting star voting is the Star Voting Project under the Equal Vote Coalition. And then the Center for Election Science promotes approval voting, which has already been implemented and successfully used in elections in Fargo, North Dakota and St. Louis, Missouri, where they passed by supermajority votes in the first place, which is super cool. I also want to address the elephant in the room, which is what is referred to as ranked choice voting, which is actually a misnomer. The real name that voting enthusiasts use to refer to this voting method is instant runoff voting, which may sound correct because the process for tabulation is called instant runoff, and that is just much more sensible. So I'm going to refer to it as instant runoff voting to be clear about what method I am referring to. I'm referring to the single winner case where people rank candidates. They have no skips. You can't have an equal number of candidates, and you do rounds of eliminations based on the top choice votes. So instant runoff voting. Unfortunately, this misnomer is indicative of basically the entirety of this voting method. There's a ton of misinformation around instant runoff voting, unfortunately. The first and foremost, it does not eliminate the spoiler effect or vote splitting. It's subject to the same vote splitting problems as choose one voting. If that doesn't make sense to you, there are a variety of ways in which I can explain it, but I think the most obvious one, the simplest one, is that instant runoff voting is literally just a series of choose one elections, right? In each round, you only get to support one candidate, as I said before. And so you still have this vote splitting problem at each round. You can't solve the problems of choose one voting by just iterating it over and over and over again. So it's still subject to the vote splitting effect, which means that it still trends toward a two-party system, just like our current choose one system. Instant runoff voting will not get us out of the duopoly. But there are other problems with instant runoff voting. For example, tabulation for instant runoff voting, unlike the vast majority of other single winner systems, needs to be centralized to a single point of failure. You've already heard me say multiple times throughout this gauntlet, the decentralization of our electoral system is incredibly important to election security because it provides a robustness and is resistant to scaled attacks on our electoral system. But if you have to centralize tabulation to a single point of failure, well, the chances of failure go up, and you can attack that and you can have a scaled attack on that election by one person. And actually, we saw an example of this already in this recent New York Democratic primary, where the tabulation was centralized to a single point of failure. That single point of failure was a board of elections that has a history of failure. With other methods, including our current system, but as well as approval voting and star voting, precincts individually can publicly report results, and then anybody anywhere can independently verify those results. But that comes up with another problem. Whereas the full ballot data is rarely ever released. And without the full ballot data, we cannot independently verify the results of the election. And so we've seen this in Maine, where they put ballots on trucks and physically drive them to a central location in Maine. And then they announce the results, but they don't tell us everything that was on the ballots, and we can't calculate that we have no way to calculate and verify that those results are actually true. And we see this all over the place. Instant runoff voting runs into a variety of problems with election codes, which is actually why the success rate for implementation of instant runoff voting in the United States is only 45%. And I can back that up. If your jaw is dropping, or if you are getting astounded by the things that I'm saying, like I'm hating on instant runoff voting, it's because modern voting science that has come up over the last 21 years has really shown us that it's not a good system. And it's actually worse than our current choose one system, and can actually, over time, produce worse results as voters get more familiar with it and start to vote strategically, where instant runoff voting performs worse under strategic voting. And I have sources and claims, and I can back all of this up. I've never had a conversation, a back and forth about instant runoff voting where the other person did not leave the conversation open to the idea that it really wasn't a good move. There are so many other reasons that instant runoff voting is actually a potential death sentence for the United States right now. It's not where we need to be focusing our time on voting method reform. We need to use methods that are actually going to get us out of the duopoly, and that's star voting and that's approval voting, which are consensus-based methods that will help to flip the dynamic of our electoral system from polarity to consensus and get us to actually start agreeing and talking to each other again and focusing on compromise solutions that work for the maximum number of people possible, rather than just being in this gridlock. So this is a really important thing. I talk about this all the time. Voting science is an incredibly unintuitive field. I've spent hundreds of hours studying it, and you really have to sit down and go through it yourself before you really start to understand all of this and figure it out on your own. And I highly recommend that you do. I highly recommend you check out the Equal Vote Coalition, the Star Voting Project, the Center for Election Science, electowiki.org, rangevoting.org. There are so many incredible resources where you can learn about this stuff, and you can always contact me publicly or privately on social media or through my website, voteforsass.com, if you have more questions or want more information. But I really, really want to emphasize that where our focus needs to be in voting method reform, it is not on instant runoff voting, it is on star voting and approval voting. I am 100% on the side of whistleblowers. Clip it, save it on your phone. I want to be very clear and state this very clearly. I absolutely believe in the job of the press to hold the government and large entities accountable, and we need clearly to have active protections for whistleblowers, because as we've seen with Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, that the freedom of the press doesn't appear to be enough, and so, constitutional amendment would be the best to provide active protections, but I'll take legislation as well, whatever I can get. But it really comes down to just like the accountability of government in general and who's in power. Government accountability is actually a pillar of my platform. So you get two pillars of my platform today, because we talked about voting method reform before, and now we're talking about government accountability. Transparency is irrelevant without accountability, and vice versa. I don't believe that our government is all that transparent, but we know that it's not accountable, because when the emails do leak or when the recordings do come out, nothing changes. So accountability needs to come from outside of the entity being held accountable. That's why I'm in support of whistleblowers. But we need something else on top of that. And that's why I am currently building a public platform where constituents in my district can log on, verify their residency. They can talk about local politics and do a variety of kind of politically motivated social media things. But the main feature is that every time I vote on a piece of legislation, they'll be able to approve or disapprove of my vote on that piece of legislation. And so they'll be able to see the legislation, kind of a summary of it, or like a plain English translation of it, some education about it, why I voted the way I voted, but then I will have a public scorecard of how representative I am of my district. And the really cool part is, it creates a continuous public feedback loop, right? So right now, government accountability comes in what forms? Emails and phone calls, which are these private channels that can be ignored. We have like just general polling, which tend to be very vague. They come by rare, they miss a lot of people. And then we have elections every 2 or 4 or 6 years, which are just these rat races, just mired in money and advertisements and all this craziness. And so having a quantifiable continuous public citizen feedback loop is really, really important to this. And what's really cool is this is going to be open source. So once we work out the bugs and kinks on me, this can be applied to every elected representative in the country without their consent, which is awesome, right? It's coming from the people, truly. You don't need any support from representatives to implement this. And we can introduce all sorts of cool features like proxy voting, where people can choose to allow somebody else to vote on their behalf on particular topics. Of course, they can always rescind that power at any time or go back and change earlier votes. And we can turn this into polling, not just about votes on legislation, but about different things that representatives do or important issues that Americans care about. And if we combine it with traditional polling, right, door knocks, phone calls, emails, letters, right, all the literature, all of that, then what that does is that empowers representatives who are in office and are fighting for the people, maybe fresher people who haven't been broken down by the system so much yet, to better fight for what's in the people's interests, right? So for example, I could go up to another representative and I could say, hey, I polled 10,000 people in your district. 6,000 of them said they voted for you. And of that, 70% said they support my unconditional basic income bill. Of the 4,000 who said they voted against you, 80% said they support my unconditional basic income bill. If you co-sponsor my bill, then I will tell all of them for you for free. And so this is a 21st century hack around the gridlock in Congress. Instead of bribing representatives with money, I'll instead be bribing them with votes. But like I said, it's only going to be votes in favor of the public interest, because that's where the data comes from. So I see this, and I have a ton of other ideas around this, and I'd love more help on building it. But we need to make the government actually accountable to the people. And there's some really cool 21st century technologies that we can leverage to make that a reality. But I'm totally on the side of whistleblowers. I'm totally on the side of accountability of government coming from the people and ensuring that the people have the freedom and power to actually hold the government accountable. Getting money out of politics is actually a bit of a cliche phrase. And that phrase stems from a lack of full understanding of the nature of our political system and the root causes of its problems. So in the US, the power of the dollar is stronger than the power of the vote. Directly decreasing the power of the dollar is effectively insurmountable right now, but we can increase the power of the vote. That's what voting method reform is all about. Voting method reform is viable because it's a bottom-up solution that takes advantage of the diversity and decentralization of American government. It's the classic method for driving change in the US, similar to marriage equality or marijuana legalization. To be clear, I support reforms that reduce the power of the dollar in politics, such as overturning Citizens United, publicly financed campaigns, limited campaign windows, contribution and spending limits, and airtime fairness rules. The point I'm making is that the old guard doesn't want to change the system that's keeping them in power, making these reforms incredibly difficult to implement until we have better representation in the first place. So I totally support all the public campaign finance reforms, and I will vote for them if there's an opportunity. I will push for them, but voting method reform, bottom up from the people, star voting and approval voting is the first step in that way. I also want to quickly acknowledge democracy dollars or democracy vouchers, where every voter gets some number of dollars every year or every election cycle that they can only put toward that they can only use to donate to political campaigns. I am in favor of democracy dollars. Andrew Yang talked about this. I do want to recognize that democracy dollars doesn't solve the fundamental problem of the power of the vote versus the power of the dollar in politics. And that implementing a nationwide democracy dollars program, say $100 a year, is more of a reset button than a permanent solution. But I am in favor of it. I believe it is worth hitting that reset button and buying ourselves 1 or 2 election cycles where money from the people can really wash out a lot of the high dollar donors in the campaign world. So I am absolutely in favor of democracy vouchers, democracy dollars, and I would want to keep them around. But again, I just want to recognize the most important and most powerful thing we can do, and we can also model and measure this too, and I've talked about this before, is the voting method reform. That's the most important thing that we can do as citizens, and it is the real change that we have the power to make in our own communities, which is why I'm actually working with the Center for Election Science to start up a campaign to bring approval voting to Austin. But if you want to learn more about that, you can tag me on social media. The Electoral College doesn't achieve what it was meant to achieve. And the reason is because, well, there's 2 big reasons. Number one, voting science did not exist in the 1780s. It just didn't. And the founding fathers didn't have the knowledge and the tools and the resources that we do to actually invent a quality voting system. They just didn't have the science. And number 2 is the way that the Electoral College was designed. The Electoral College was an 11th hour addition to the Constitution very near the end of the Constitutional Convention. It was a last minute realization, oh no, we need to figure something out. And basically what happened is it was sent off to a committee of 2 or 3 guys, and they came up with something overnight and they submitted it, and everybody just said, all right, cool, whatever, doesn't matter, we'll fix it later. And that's really what happened. We have a lot of really detailed notes about what happened throughout the Constitutional Convention, which lasted 100 days, and it was coming toward an end, and they just wanted to be done with it. So the Electoral College does not ensure that states the power is more like along the states or whatever it is. All the Electoral College is just an extra layer of winner take all, which is another name for choose one voting, is another layer of winner take all voting, and combined with this chunking mechanism that just throws noise into the election process. So right now across the country, we are using a winner take all system, and then that is fed into another winner take all, that's fed into a chunking system that's fed into another winner take all system. And this just creates this incredible, like I said earlier, polarization that is mechanically caused by the system. It is what has put us in this duopoly. But furthermore, with the Electoral College specifically, is that the votes that matter are only the votes in the swing states. And we know this because those are the only places that presidential candidates go. They only go to the swing states, so that's the only states that matter. The Electoral College does not help out smaller states. It does not empower smaller states. If it did, then Wyoming would be a swing state, right? But it also doesn't help out bigger states either necessarily. If it did, then California would be a swing state, but it's not. It's a random assortment. Which states happen to be on that dividing line between red and blue. Those are the states that get all of the attention. And it's totally unfair to Americans around the country. And it, like I said, it doesn't do any of the things it was set out to do because the people who invented it didn't know what they were doing and they didn't put any effort into it. Abolishing the Electoral College outright would require a constitutional amendment. I would be in favor of that if that came up. It's not going to come up. It's not going to happen. Right now, there is a movement for something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. I don't want to get too deep into the details of it, but it is a way to at least get rid of one layer, or at least get rid of the chunking problem of the Electoral College. You still have a majority problem baked in there, which is a whole other thing. Like I said, voting science is unintuitive. But it doesn't solve the full set of issues because you need to solve both layers of winner take all and you need to solve the chunking problem. I've actually written extensively on this. I wrote a paper, it's over 5,000 words long. I also have condensed versions as well. You can hit me up on Twitter, social media, or direct message me, and I can send you the link to it. There is a way to actually that is compatible, both the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, as well as being compatible with alternate voting methods. Of course, approval voting and star voting, but actually any voting method. This is a huge problem that has plagued voting scientists forever. How do we combine everything together? Well, I came up with a solution, a custom-built solution for the United States for presidential elections that can be implemented at individual state levels, and as more states join on to this, it's like a pseudo compact, but it's similar to the national popular vote, but much more comprehensive. That would allow us to actually kind of subdue or subvert the Electoral College in a way that also encourages states to reform their voting methods, to increase the power of the vote, to move toward consensus-building voting methods rather than polarizing voting methods. So that way we can get a president who's actually representative of the views of the people. And that's really what it comes down to, right? We're talking about democracy here. It needs to represent what the people want. So the Electoral College, huge problem. Addressing it is a very difficult thing. I have put in a lot of work and ideas around how to tackle it. And so if you want to get into the nitty gritty, which we've already done more than enough today, you hit me up and I can get you that information. We can have a conversation about it. But yes, I think the Electoral College is important and I want to get rid of it. And that's where I'm at.